It was a Tuesday like any other, or so I thought. I am Charles, a bus driver for over 15 years, and that night, I was on my usual route, crossing the rainy streets of Glenwood, a quiet little town in the interior of the United States. The time was already past 10 at night, and the bus was almost empty, just 3 or 4 passengers, all quiet, lost in their own thoughts or staring at their cell phones. The rain pounded on the windshield, and the streets were deserted. The silence inside the bus was only broken by the sound of the engine and the rhythmic noise of the windshield wipers. I was accustomed to these lonely nights, so nothing seemed out of the ordinary, until something happened that left me with a strange feeling, something I couldn't explain. As I drove along the road leading to the city's most remote neighborhood, I noticed a bus stop that I had never seen before. It was there, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by tall trees and a mist that seemed to dance under the weak light of the nearby street lamp. I was confused, as I knew that route inside and out, and I was certain there was no stop at that location. Yet, instinctively, I slowed down and stopped the bus. I can't say what made me do it. Perhaps it was fatigue, or maybe curiosity. But that's when things started to get weird. A woman boarded the bus. She was completely soaked, her hair plastered to her face, and her expression was hard to decipher. She didn't say a word, just walked in and went straight to the back of the bus, sitting on the last bench, right next to the window. I'm not easily frightened, but something about that woman bothered me. She was so quiet, so out of the ordinary. I looked in the rearview mirror, trying to figure out what made me so uneasy, but the other passengers seemed not to notice her. They continued as they were, indifferent, as if she were invisible. I swallowed hard and continued the journey. But the feeling that something was wrong didn't leave me. As the bus moved forward, I realized that the stop where the woman had boarded wasn't on the official itinerary, and the surrounding landscape seemed increasingly sinister. The trees appeared to be closing in on the road, as if they were encircling us, and the mist that had been sparse before now seemed dense, almost suffocating. Then, the whispers started. It was a low murmur, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each mile traveled. It came from the back of the bus, from where the woman was sitting. I looked again through the rearview mirror, but all I saw was darkness. The sound continued, sounding like a lament, like someone crying softly. I decided to stop the bus. "Is anyone there?" I shouted, trying to sound firm, but my voice faltered at the end. Silence. No sound other than the rain outside. I knew I wasn't alone, that the woman was there, but when I turned to face her, the bench was empty. My heart raced. I searched the entire bus, but she had simply vanished. The passengers looked at me confused, not understanding why I was so agitated. I returned to the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I tried to calm down. Something terrible had happened, and I still had no idea what it was. After that night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the woman disappearing in the back of the bus haunted me. I returned to work the next day, trying to move on, but part of me knew I needed answers. So, after my shift, I decided to investigate. I started by asking my fellow drivers, but none of them seemed to know anything about that bus stop or the mysterious woman. Some even joked, saying I had seen a ghost. The idea seemed ridiculous, but at the same time, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I decided to return to the place where the woman had boarded, on that deserted road. The bus stop was still there, but it looked different in daylight. It seemed as though it had been forgotten by time, with peeling paint and an old cracked wooden bench. I walked around the area, trying to find some clue, and that's when I saw it. There was an old metal sign, almost covered by vegetation. When I cleaned off the dirt, I could read what was written, "St. Clara Retreat Home." I asked some locals, and they told me a story that chilled me to the bone. Years ago, there was a retreat house there, where nuns took care of women in difficult situations. But something terrible happened. One of the women, named Isabella, was brutally murdered by someone who was never identified. They say her spirit never rested and that on rainy nights, she roams the road, seeking vengeance. That story paralyzed me. I knew Isabella was the woman who had entered my bus that night. Everything made sense now, the non-existent bus stop, the whispers, her disappearance. But what terrified me the most was that, from that day on, I began to hear the whispers again, even when the bus was empty. They followed me, as if Isabella was still nearby, watching me, waiting for something I didn't know. I still drive that route, but every time I pass that bus stop, I feel a chill down my spine, and fear takes over me. I don't know if she will ever stop haunting me, but one thing is certain: that night changed my life forever, and I will never be the same. This is my story, and I hope you never go through something like this. Because when the line between the world of the living and the dead crosses, there's no going back. What I saw and heard that night made me believe that some souls are trapped, doomed to relive their last moments, and unfortunately, sometimes they cross paths with ordinary people like me. And that, my friends, is a fate worse than death itself. It was a rainy night, the kind where the rain doesn't let up and the streets of St. Michael, a small town in the interior, turn into rivers. My name is Edward, and I was on another nighttime journey, driving bus line 67. I had been navigating the city streets for nearly 20 years, and nothing surprised me anymore. But that night, something different was in the air, something I couldn't quite identify. The traffic was chaotic, with cars stopped in all directions, and the torrential rain only worsened the situation. I knew that if I continued on the usual path, it would take hours to complete the route, so I decided to take a shortcut. It was a street I usually didn't use, but I had passed through it a few times during the day. I saw no harm in taking this alternative route. As I progressed, the streets began to turn strangely unfamiliar. The streetlights were too far apart, casting long distorted shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The few remaining passengers on the bus were restless, but said nothing. I, on the other hand, started to feel an increasing anxiety, as if something was out of place. The buildings around began to change. What were once simple concrete constructions now looked like ruins of an abandoned city. The facades were deteriorated, with broken windows and doors falling apart. It seemed as though I had crossed into a part of the town that time had forgotten, a place that shouldn't exist. The bus's GPS began to fail, showing only an empty screen, as if it couldn't locate my position. The streets turned into a labyrinth, and every turn seemed to lead me deeper into a nightmare I couldn't wake from. I tried to stay calm, thinking it was just the rain and fatigue messing with my head, but deep down, I knew something was very wrong. Then things began to worsen. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw that one of the passengers, an elderly man who had been sitting near the door, was no longer there. His seat was empty, but in his place, I found an old pocket watch, something he would never use. There was no sign that he had left, no noise, nothing. He had simply disappeared. I continued forward, trying to find a way out of this crumbling street maze, but the passengers kept disappearing one by one, leaving behind items that made no sense. A porcelain doll, a black cover book with no title, an old compass pointing south even when I turned it. With each disappearance, my sense of dread increased. I was alone on a bus that seemed to be devoured by this ghost town. The rain intensified, and the sound of droplets hitting the bus roof seemed like the drumming of a sinister drum. By now, I was completely disoriented, lost in a place that shouldn't exist. The familiar streets had turned into nightmarish labyrinths, where each corner hid a new vision of horror. The buildings around me were in ruins, as if they had been abandoned decades ago. The feeling that something or someone was watching me grew stronger. In every alley, I saw shadows that seemed to move, but when I looked directly, there was nothing. Just darkness and the incessant sound of the rain. Finally, when all the passengers had disappeared, leaving only those strange memories behind, I realized the truth. I was no longer in St. Michael. I didn't know where I was, but the city around me was a distorted version, a kind of dark reflection of the world I knew. It was as if I had crossed into a parallel dimension, a place where time and reality made no sense. Desperate, I began to drive faster, trying to find a way out, but it seemed the city stretched infinitely. Each street led to another identical one, and the crumbling buildings repeated as if I were stuck in an endless loop. The only thing that changed were the shadows, which became denser and closer, as if they wanted to swallow me. Then, I heard a sound from behind. It was the noise of footsteps, heavy and slow, approaching. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw a figure, dressed in a dark raincoat, standing at the back of the bus. I didn't recognize her, but there was something profoundly wrong with her. I couldn't see her face, hidden in the shadow, but I felt her eyes fixed on me. I knew I couldn't stop. If I did, something worse than death would reach me. I continued driving, terror taking over me, as that figure slowly approached. Each time I looked in the rearview mirror, she was closer, until she finally reached the first row of seats, right behind me. My breathing was ragged, sweat ran down my face, mixing with tears I hadn't realized I was shedding. The city around me continued to deteriorate, the buildings crumbling to dust, and the night sky growing darker, without a single star to guide my way. I don't know how much time passed, maybe minutes, maybe hours, but suddenly, the bus began to decelerate on its own. The engine groaned as if dying, and the lights started flickering. The figure was beside me now, so close that I could feel the cold emanating from her. The bus stopped completely, in the middle of an endless deserted street. I knew I was trapped, doomed to drive through that ghost town forever. And so, with trembling hands and a heavy heart, I turned off the engine, accepting my fate. The last thing I saw before fading into the darkness was the figure taking the driver's seat, taking control, as I vanished into oblivion. And so, I continued to wander through this non-existent city, driving a bus with no destination, trapped in a dimension where time does not pass and horror never ends. I hope no one ever travels down this road, because if they do, they might end up like me, lost forever, with no hope of escape. My name is Rodney, and I've been a bus driver for nearly 20 years. Throughout this time, I faced everything: flooded streets, problematic passengers, accidents. But nothing prepared me for what happened on that rainy night. I work on Line 402, a route that covers much of the outskirts of a small town in the heart of the United States. The last trip of the day always ends around midnight, and after that, I return to the garage, park the bus, and head home to rest. But that night, something strange began to happen. It was 11:45 p.m., and I was at the penultimate stop, waiting a few minutes before heading to the final point. The rain poured down in torrents, and the streets were deserted. My bus was almost empty, with just 3 or 4 passengers, all quiet, tired from a long day's work. So far, everything was normal. But then, when I looked at the electronic itinerary panel, I saw that the final destination had changed. Instead of the usual garage, the name Hallowed Field appeared. I was confused because I had never seen that name before, and it certainly wasn't part of my route. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was a system error, something that could be resolved the next day. But curiosity began to eat away at me. What was this Hallowed Field? And why, suddenly, did it appear as the final destination? I looked in the rearview mirror and saw that the passengers seemed indifferent, as if they noticed nothing wrong. One of them, an elderly woman, was dozing off, while the others were absorbed in their own thoughts. The clock struck midnight, and I decided to follow the new route. Something inside me, a mix of curiosity and a slight fear, made me continue. I followed the instructions on the panel and headed toward the so-called Hallowed Field. The streets became increasingly deserted and dark, and the rain seemed to beat harder on the bus windows. The city around seemed to disappear, replaced by a growing sense of isolation. The few remaining buildings were just shadows, indistinct figures lost in the darkness. When I finally arrived at the destination, I found myself parked in front of a rusty gate leading to an abandoned cemetery. The trees around swayed to the rhythm of the wind, and the mist covered the tombstones like a veil. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at that nightmarish scene, unsure of what to do. The cemetery was completely deserted, and the only light came from the bus headlights, which seemed to be devoured by the darkness around. I decided to turn around and get out of there as quickly as possible. But when I stepped on the accelerator, I felt an invisible force pulling the bus into the cemetery. The engine roared in protest, but it was no use. It was as if the bus was being sucked into that place. I looked back, trying to understand what was happening, and that's when I realized that the passengers had disappeared. The seats were empty, except for a chilling cold that seemed to emanate from the floor. Terror took hold of me as the bus was slowly dragged into the cemetery. There was nothing I could do to stop it. I tried to reverse, turn the steering wheel, but it seemed that all forces were against me. The bus moved on its own, as if guided by a malevolent will. When I finally stopped, the gate closed with a bang, sealing my fate in that God-forgotten place. The mist spread across the ground, covering everything in a thick mantle. I got out of the bus, feeling the cold, damp air against my face. My heart pounded hard, and I struggled to stay calm. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of an owl. I walked among the tombstones, trying to understand what was happening, when I saw something that left me paralyzed. On one of the tombstones was engraved the name of one of my regular passengers, a woman I saw every week boarding the bus for work. The name, the date of birth, everything matched her. But the worst part was the date of death, that very day. I stood there, staring at the cold stone, trying to process what that meant. How could her name be there if she was alive, or at least, had been until she boarded my bus? I continued walking, each step heavier than the last, until I came across another tombstone, this time with the name of an old friend of mine, who I knew to be alive. The date of death also corresponded to today. The sensation that something terrible was about to happen intensified with every second. And then I saw it. Amidst many moss-covered tombstones, there was one that seemed new, recently placed. The name on it was mine. My body was paralyzed, cold sweat ran down my back, and a knot formed in my throat. The date of death was that night. I was destined to die there, in that place. The realization fell upon me like an unbearable weight. I was trapped in a cycle of horror, where each night the bus took me to the cemetery, and each night I would find my name there, engraved in stone. Desperate, I ran back to the bus, trying to escape that curse. But upon reaching the door, I realized it was locked. The engine was dead, and the lights had gone out. There was no more running away. The wind howled among the trees, carrying the sound of approaching footsteps. I knew my time had come. Then I remembered something that the old drivers used to say, that the final destination is always the point where the journey ends. I understood too late that my journey would end there, in that cemetery, where my name was written. The figure that approached emerged from the mist, and I knew it was the end. And so, in the darkness of that rainy night, I disappeared, along with the bus and all its passengers. My name, engraved in the cold stone, is the only remembrance of what happened that night. And every night, a new driver takes the same route, until the clock strikes midnight, and the final destination changes to hallowed field. This is my account, and if someday you find a road leading to a forgotten place, think twice before moving forward. Because you might also be about to discover your own name engraved in stone, in a place where time does not forgive, and destiny cannot be avoided. My name is Xavier, and I've been a bus driver for over 15 years. Throughout these years, I've heard many road stories, the kind that older drivers like to tell to spook the rookies. I never really paid much attention to these tales, always considering them mere superstitions, things people invent to spice up the monotonous routine of night drives. But after that night, everything changed. It was a Thursday, and a massive storm was ravaging the area around Blackwood, a small town in the heart of Kentucky. I was on Route 305, a line that runs through rural areas where the roads are narrow and poorly lit. The bus was almost full, despite the torrential rain outside. The passengers were restless, some murmuring that the journey should be canceled because of the weather, but the company insisted that the route had to be completed. Everything was going as well as could be expected under the conditions, until I received an alert on the radio. A landslide had blocked the main road, and all vehicles needed to take a detour via Old Mill Road. When I heard this, a chill ran down my spine. Old Mill Road was known to be dangerous, not just because of its sharp curves and lack of maintenance, but also because of the dark stories that surrounded the place. It was said that the road was cursed, that it had been the scene of a tragedy many years ago. A bus, just like mine, had fallen off a cliff during a storm, killing all the passengers on board. Since then, drivers avoided it, especially at night and even worse, during storms. But that night, I had no choice. I took a deep breath and headed toward the detour, trying to push the ominous thoughts from my mind. As we advanced, the road became increasingly narrow and winding. Trees on both sides formed a natural tunnel, blocking what little light remained in the night sky. The rain pounded on the roof of the bus, and the headlights barely illuminated the path ahead. The air inside the bus was thick, and I could feel the passengers' tension rising. I tried to focus on the road, but something inside me said that there was more at play that night than just a difficult route. That's when the bus began to falter. The engine groaned and coughed, and then suddenly, it died completely. The lights went out, and the bus came to a stop in the middle of the road, enveloped in darkness. I tried to restart the engine, but it wouldn't respond. The passengers began to murmur, restless, some genuinely scared. I knew I needed to go out and check what was wrong with the engine, but something told me this wouldn't be a simple task. With a flashlight in hand, I stepped off the bus and made my way to the front, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. The wind was strong, and the rain soaked me within seconds. When I opened the hood, I couldn't see anything wrong, but the engine just wouldn't start. That's when I began to hear the whispers. They were low, almost imperceptible, but they were there, coming from all directions. I looked around, but saw nothing but the shadows of trees swaying in the wind. The whispers grew louder, as if something or someone was approaching. A chill ran up my spine, and I felt the undeniable presence of someone, or something, nearby. I tried to focus on the engine, but my mind was overwhelmed by a mix of fear and confusion. Suddenly, I felt a presence beside me, as if someone was standing there, watching my every move. I turned quickly, and that's when I saw the shadows. Among the trees, indistinct figures seemed to move, lurking in the dark. They were shapeless, just shadows, but I could feel the malevolence emanating from them. They were like remnants of lost souls, trapped on that forgotten road. One of the whispers stood out from the rest, clearer and closer. It was a low, drawn-out voice that seemed to come from inside my head. "Join us." My first instinct was to back away, but I tripped and nearly fell. The shadowy figures seemed to advance, slowly, as if surrounding the bus. I knew I couldn't stay there. With my heart racing, I ran back to the bus and locked the door, but as I entered, I realized something was terribly wrong. The passengers, who had been restless earlier, were now in complete silence. Each one had a vacant expression, as if frozen in time. The atmosphere inside the bus was oppressive, and the air felt heavy, hard to breathe. One by one, the passengers began to disappear. There were no screams, no signs of struggle. They just vanished, leaving their seats empty. And then I noticed that where they had been sitting, there were marks of moisture, as if they had been left behind by something that came with the rain. The tension was unbearable. I needed to get out of there, but the bus remained dead, and the shadows outside were getting closer. The feeling of being watched intensified, and then I saw it in the rearview mirror. I wasn't alone in the cabin. There was a figure behind me, sitting in the fare collector's seat. It was a man, with a pale face and eyes that looked lifeless. He watched me in silence, not making any movement. My entire body trembled, and fear paralyzed me. Finally, the figure spoke in a whisper that seemed to echo throughout the bus. "We died here, and now it's your turn." I knew what this meant. The story I had heard about the accident on Old Mill Road wasn't just a legend. It was real. And I was about to share the same tragic fate. With a last effort of courage, I tried once more to start the bus, and to my surprise, it responded. The engine roared to life, the lights came on, and I pressed the accelerator hard, speeding away from that cursed road. I drove like a madman, not looking back, with the shadows still following me, as if they were ghosts trying to drag me back. When I finally left Old Mill Road and returned to the main route, the relief was overwhelming, but the fear remained, clinging to my soul. I reached the final destination, but the bus was empty, except for the damp marks on the seats. I never heard from the passengers of that night again, and I don't even know if they truly existed. Since then, I avoid that road at all costs, because I know its curse is real, and those who pass through there at night are never the same again. If you ever find yourself driving on an old, deserted road, remember that not everything is as it seems, and there are things in the shadows waiting patiently for a new soul to join them. I was lucky to escape, but I know that eventually, time will run out, and the curse of Old Mill Road will find me again.